so much for, first of all, for inviting me. And this is my very first talk about my research. So I'm excited to be here. I'm nervous and excited to hear your comments. Well, I'm going to start my presentation by outlining several major sources of this content in the Ferghana Valley, an important region that is the heartland of present-day Uzbekistan. In 1898, the Muslim population of Andijan revolted against the Russians living in the Ferghana Valley. The revolt, which was described by Russian scholars as the most dramatic form of Muslim unrest against Russian rule, erupted on May 18, when an angry crowd, under the leadership of the Sheikh of the Naqshbandi Sufi order, attacked the Russian garrison. 22 sleeping Russian soldiers were killed and about 20 wounded. This revolt caused Russian officials to be concerned about any Muslim activity or movement in the region. From 1905 to 1907 and on into 1914, state officials' worries doubled as widespread banditry and political violence reveal an area roiling with revolutionary and social discontent. The anti-government unrest by Russian revolutionaries, many of whom belonged to radical organizations and supported political violence against Russian officials, added to the already existing fears of an anti-Russian revolt by Ferghana's colonized Muslims. The valley exploded in violence again in 1916, when the Muslim population not only protested conscription to the Russian army, but also called for a holy war against the Russians. In 1920, another revolt, organized by the Basmachi, or as the Russians refer to them, Muslim bandits of the Ferghana Valley, threatened the entire Soviet enterprise in Turkestan. These revolts clearly show that the early 20th century, the Ferghana Valley was not a tranquil place and was an area of continued concern for imperial authorities. To understand the tensions of the region, a brief history of the area and the importance of the region is necessary. A fertile valley along the parched path of the Great Silk Road, in the heartland of present-day Uzbekistan, Ferghana had seen culture, ideas, and philosophies exchanged alongside the goods of East and West for centuries. People gravitated to the region along with silks and spices and settled into agricultural and mercantile villages, finding protection from the all too common attacks and wars, finding protection in the depths of the valley within its protective mountain ridges. Because of its many draws, by the end of the 19th century, the Ferghana Valley was one of the most densely populated multi-ethnic Central Asian areas. From its incorporation into the Russian Empire in 1876, the Ferghana Valley was important to Russia strategically, politically, and economically. Its geographic location and proximity to neighboring countries and regions made it ideal for participation in the Great Game, an ongoing rivalry for trade, influence, and land in the Near East. Rivaling Great Britain, Russia wanted access to this strategically valuable point, situated along an important trade route to India. Influenced by the spread of the British Empire in India, the Russians planned to develop similar economic, military, and cultural strongholds in the area. The rivalry with Britain was particularly evident in the officials' concern over cotton production in the Ferghana Valley. The Ferghana Valley was the main cotton region for the Russian Empire, where more than 50% of all irrigated land was used for planting cotton. The Russians needed cotton for their textile industry, which was a great source of income, and cotton was especially essential at this time after supplies from the United States decreased during the American Civil War. Cotton was also used in the manufacture of gunpowder. Economic factors were of great importance as they were a baseline for social and cultural changes in the Ferghana Valley. Investment in the infrastructure of the Ferghana Valley led to an increased imperial presence, which in its turn led to building the railroads. The Russians built the railroads in order to maximize control. As railroads moved into the area, Russian authorities became even further invested in the Ferghana Valley, and their anxiety for ruling power, evident in their eager and almost frantic investment, indicated a fear of losing the territory. In addition to increasing the economic investment of Russians in the region, the railroads came to be a source of social and cultural anxiety. The influx of Turkic and Persian people, as well as migrants from Central Russia, the Caucasus, and other places, led to rapid urbanization, overcrowding, and social chaos, which in its turn led to a rise in alcohol consumption, prostitution, and other problems. Ferghana Valley remains important today as a crossroad between Eastern and Western ideologies, with rich resources of oil and cotton. Located close to important regional actors such as Iran, Afghanistan, and Russia, the region is a vital policy interest geopolitically and economically. Whereas there is very little research on the Ferghana Valley in general, and anti-Russian, anti-government revolts and sources of discontent in particular, Russian, Central Asian, and Western scholars do acknowledge the 1898, 1916, and 1920 revolts. We go back to so they do acknowledge the 1898, 1916, and 1920 revolts, but even so, scholars tend to focus on the revolt of 1916. There are no major contributions from either Russian or English language historians on the subject of unrest in the Ferghana Valley during the revolutionary period of 1905 to 1914, and particularly glaring is the lack of information on the radical unrest from 1905 to 1907. Despite the numerous bandits, revolutionaries, and radicals, in the face of economic dislocation, hyper-urbanization, and unlawful land seizure by Russian peasants, this restive area has been dismissed as a region where not much, in terms of revolutionary activities, was going on. Moreover, most Central Asian scholars overlook the relevance of political violence or banditry in the region, concentrating instead on other places like Tashkent, the imperial capital of Turkestan. My study reveals a different and compelling story by showing that the Ferghana Valley, crossed by railroads and unsettled by newcomers, new ideas, and rapid social change, was a hotbed of revolutionary activity after 1905. In this study, I look at the role of outsiders who came to the Ferghana Valley in the early 20th century and contributed to making the valley an area of anxieties. Turkestan, Ferghana Valley as part of Turkestan, according to the Central Asian historian Jeff Sahadeo, was a dumping ground for unwanted migrants. Persian immigrants came to work in the Ferghana Valley. Railroad workers came and organized revolutionary radical groups. Political exiles were forced to the region. Outsiders from the Caucasus followed opportunity and started their business in the region. Outsiders joined forces with the local population to organize criminal bands and terrorize the Ferghana population. Political exiles and those who joined the social revolutionaries or anarchists started carrying out assassinations of Ferghana officials. Russian officials were concerned that since the construction of railroads, there was, as they wrote, a mass of wandering folk who committed dark deeds and required an enhanced surveillance, and argued that increased robberies were a result of all of these newcomers. The conservative Muslim population of the Ferghana Valley, as well as Muslim activists, were not supportive of the social and cultural changes that occurred in the region. They not only feared the rise of crime, but they were also concerned about increases in alcoholism and prostitution. After the Russian conquest, alcohol consumption among the local Central Asian population in the Ferghana area increased sharply. Russian authorities worried that the corruption of the Ferghana population by prostitution and alcohol, widely considered problems of foreign origin, would cause resentment among conservative Muslims against Russian rule. Alcohol and prostitutes in the Ferghana Valley were perceived as a symbol of public disorder and as a threat to the already fragile Ferghana society, equally contributing to political division and incoherence as revolutionary terrorism and banditry. My analysis of the Ferghana Valley as the crossroad, as a crossroads of political, economic, and ethnic activity reveals three new aspects of the region: an area of anxiety, an area of banditry and political violence, and an area that reflects the larger concerns about Russia's control and authority over its rural outposts. This is the first study in English or Russian to examine closely, at the local level, a variety of issues that emerged in the historically important Ferghana Valley during the revolutionary period of 1905 to 1907 and beyond. My work reveals a Ferghana Valley that was neither impassive nor serene during the years of 1905-1914. Instead, I uncover a region where economic, cultural, and social dislocation bred violence, discontent, and disorder. This dissertation relies largely on primary sources located and researched in Moscow, such as periodicals from 1905 to 1914, journals, and archival records, including official and unofficial press published in the Russian language in Turkestan. Police and military archives supplied memoranda and reports from officials, informants and populations, as did national archives in Russia and Uzbekistan. Weaving together these sources, I create a new, fuller portrait of an important region of Central Asia that not only was situated astride major trade routes for commodities, but, I suggest, was a center for exchange of political concepts and ideological transformation. This research explores precisely the extent to which the Ferghana Valley served as the crossroads for revolutionary ideals prevalent in early 20th century Europe and Asia. Fear that the local Central Asian population would be affected by the revolutionary movement came not just from internal pressures, but also from the international context. Persia had a constitutional revolution in 1905, the Ottoman Empire in 1908, the revolution occurred in China in 1911. The limits on authorities of rulers in Persia and the Ottoman Empire through parliament and constitutions were short-lived. That the revolutions challenged and transformed the former autocratic regimes and created anxiety in Persia and the Ottoman Empire, as well as among Russian authorities who had already had difficulty coping with their own revolutionary demands for constitutional reforms. The Russian central authorities were perhaps aware of the fact that the situation in neighboring Muslim countries could have inspired the Muslims of the Russian Empire, especially because political movements in Persia and the Ottoman Empire had supporters and collaborators from the Russian Empire. Using a comparative approach that incorporates the histories of Imperial Russia and Russian-dominated Central Asia, I explore how the Russian revolutionary movements and constitutional revolution impacted the population of the Ferghana Valley through cultural, religious, administrative, and colonial ties, and assess which categories, classes, and nationalities were most affected by revolutionary and constitutional movements in neighboring Russia, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. In addition, my work contributes to a better understanding of how Russian policies worked or didn't in Central Asia, and how Russian authorities dealt with Muslim groups. This research is important for understanding how Central Russian authorities were able to handle problems in their provinces, and demonstrates the limit of imperial power and authority. While authorities expressed great worry over the region, their power within the area was limited. The success of social movements from 1905 to 1907, particularly radicals or terrorists and bandits, discredited the Russian Empire and Russian authorities, and revealed Russian authorities struggling and failing to cope with this border region of the empire. For today's presentation, I would like to outline one major social movement that I use in the dissertation to reveal the stresses of empire, and that is banditry, which was one of the major destabilizing factors during the revolutionary era. Excuse me. I argue, using theories from Eric Hobsbawm and John Neuberger, that political uncertainty in Ferghana was expressed through banditry. There are very few studies on crime and banditry in Central Asia during this examined period. No study has been published specifically on banditry in the Ferghana Valley, even though the chaos that the journalists decried had been the focus of newspapers since 1905. It has become scary to leave, one of the local newspapers reported in 1906. They, referring to bandits, know that there is arbitrariness and disorganization. We have all kinds of hooligans, blackmailers, extortionists, and robbers. In fact, these people have become masters of our lives. They rob people in the middle of the day, in front of the police who don't take any action. With their attention firmly fixed on the Ferghana Valley, most of the urgent reports of Turkestan military governors to the War Ministry reflected this same anxiety and recounted episodes of burglary, robbery, theft, assault, and murder. According to public accounts and government perceptions, crime in the Ferghana Valley raged out of control from 1905 to 1910, as banditry flourished in every city and village. Newspapers warned of bandits who formed criminal gangs that robbed and terrified people, while government reports identified a rising tide of instability. Railway construction was cited as one of the main reasons for the spread of banditry. Railway construction had a positive economic impact on the region, but it also brought in immigrants. On the one hand, the Tsarist officials were excited about the fact that the railway connected the Ferghana Valley with the regions of central Russia, which contributed to the rapid development of trade and establishment of economic ties between Turkestan and Russia. On the other hand, despite the economic development, the railway construction raised concern among the Russian officials because it allowed movement of more than goods. Everyone, including criminals, revolutionaries, those who were sentenced to hard labor or exile, people from the Caucasus, Persia, and elsewhere, used the railway. And when the railway was constructed through the Ferghana Valley, many of these unwanted people did indeed arrive in the region. Because of the geographical proximity and political and economic ties, hundreds of thousands of unemployed Persians searched for jobs in Transcaucasia and Central Asia. Many of them participated in building the Central Asian Railroad. Others migrated to the cotton, oil, soap, and brick factories in the Ferghana Valley for pay considerably lower than that of their Russian and Uzbek counterparts. The belief that the migrants created trouble was widespread in Ferghana and elsewhere. Most robbers in the period examined were described first according to ethnicity, rather than age, sex, or any other categorization. Perhaps this had to do with the fact that Russian authorities tried to emphasize the large number of non-Russians involved in criminal activities in the Ferghana Valley. Thus, ethnicity seemed to play a major role when describing the criminal bands. Many bands were composed of recent arrivals to the Ferghana region from Russia, the Caucasus, or Persia. In similar fashion, the local Turkestan and Ferghana newspapers and military and police department reports emphasized that many outsiders were involved in gangs. People from Persia and the Caucasus were also mentioned when the periodicals reported the discovery of revolvers and rifles. The inclusion of Caucasians among the bandits spoke directly to anxieties of empire in the late imperial period. The Russian officials perceived the Caucasian tribes as ignoble brutes. Dealing with the Caucasus was a difficult task for the Russians. Russian officials opined. Our lengthy presence in Caucasia has already revealed that the influence of the Muslim clergy on the people is absolutely contrary to our interests, for they stir up fanaticism and hostility towards us. Pro-constitutional democratic newspaper affirmed that the Russian authorities considered the Caucasus one of the most seditious corners of our empire because of daily assassinations and attempted murders on officials. During the revolution of 1905, the Russian authorities in the Caucasus were weak and incapable of dealing with banditry and other issues. With the arrival of immigrants from the Caucasus to the Ferghana Valley, the threat of instability, crime, lack of loyalty, and fear of revolt doubled in the valley. There were the issues that Russian authorities in Ferghana already, these were the issues that the Russian authorities in Ferghana already faced. But the arrival of people from the Caucasus and Persia seemingly increased these troubles. The Ferghana authorities perhaps feared the cooperation of people from two unstable regions that Russia added to its empire fairly recently. Russian officials blamed the outsiders for influencing the local Muslim population, many of whom readily joined or organized their own bands. One could find in newspapers numerous descriptions of large and fearless bands that consisted of Ferghana Muslims. The stories of local Ferghana Muslim robbers robbing in the middle of the day in front of large crowds of people were common in the examined period. For example, a wealthy merchant by the last name Babajanov was robbed by a band of 20 people who were armed with knives, rifles, and revolvers. They tortured the owner of the house in order to learn where he hid his money. A local policeman, excuse me, I'm gonna have a sip of wine. A local policeman learned about the robbery while it was still going on. He took with him 3 police horsemen and went with them to the Babajanov's house. When he approached the house, he saw about 300 people standing there watching the robbery. When the policeman went into the house to arrest the group, the horsemen who came with him as his backup refused to follow him. The arrival of a policeman and even his shooting did not scare the bandits who continued robbing the house. There was only one local man who was able to lock the robbers in the room and help the policeman out of the house. The brazen behavior of bandits was astonishing. Another local newspaper reported on the robbery and murder of a wealthy merchant. While some of the members of the group, which also consisted of Ferghana Muslims, tortured and robbed the owner and his family, others drove on their horses around the house and demanded refreshments from nearby tea houses. They also watched people, and if they did not like something, shot in the air from time to time. While newspapers and official reports tended towards sweeping generalizations, the reality was that the bandits tended to be multi-ethnic groups, often including some locals. They did not represent one ethnic group or class, which is what made it more difficult for the authorities to keep them in check. These individuals either joined the bands with the Ferghana local Muslim population or formed the new bands that included people of different ethnicity. A local newspaper reported on one large multi-ethnic band which consisted of people, members of this band always were dressed up in Central Asian clothes. Their faces were smeared with soot, but they all spoke Turkic, Persian, and Russian languages. Several members of this group usually carried out the robbery, while others guarded the entrance and shot at the crowd from the roof. Many bands consisted of local settled and nomadic residents. Some had been sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, either after the infamous 1898 Andijan revolt that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, or after committing other crimes. But many escaped from exile and returned to their native villages. Landless, they formed or joined local bands. When Madumar Igamberdiyev, who was sentenced in 1905 to 12 years of hard labor, escaped in 1907, he returned to his native Yangi Qishlaq village and became a leader of a band. The official newspaper reported that residents of his village did not give him away because they were terrified. The case of Yangi Qishlaq reveals that villagers usually knew who the bandits were, but they did not complain out of fear of revenge. The response of villagers reveals the very real limits of imperial power. The local population did not trust the Russian authorities and its legal system. People knew that most of those sentenced by the judges to hard labor and exile would escape and return to their native Ferghana for revenge. Newspapers carried many stories of such occurrences. The official Turkestan newspaper reported a case in which someone shot a man and then hung his body from a tree. Later reports revealed that the murderer was the above-mentioned Madumari Gambirdiyev, whom I just mentioned, who had escaped a sentence of hard labor in Siberia, and he killed and hanged this man because that man apparently threatened to report him to the local authorities. The arrival of Caucasian immigrants diversified banditry. There were groups that consisted of Armenians, as well as Tatars, Russians, and Jews. One group that was discovered in Kokand consisted of 3 Persians and 3 Armenians, all of whom were armed with revolvers, rifles, knives, and gunpowder. There were numerous bands that were composed of Central Asians and Persians, united in criminal activity. According to the diary of the head of the Margilan, it's one of the cities of the Ferghana Valley, Margilan police station, the Andijan region sheltered a multinational band of organized criminals. These newly arrived individuals made eradication of gangs even harder for the police. The Chief of Staff of the Department of Military stated in a 1908 memorandum that during this liberating period, there was a considerable increase in robberies organized by the settled and nomadic Central Asians and those who recently arrived in the region, the majority of whom came from the Caucasus as well as Persia. If the gangs that consisted of Central Asians enjoyed some loyalty in their communities, even out of fear, the newly arrived people were outsiders and did not have attachment to any ethnic group or community in the region. The Ferghana bandits could not be considered social rebels in the mold of Hobsbawm, as most of them lacked the local roots of social bandits. The formation of multi-ethnic gangs presented a real problem for the Russian authorities, making it more difficult to halt robberies. By not being able to control the immigrants and their collaboration with the Central Asian and local Russian population in organizing criminal groups, Russian officials could not fully enforce their authority and restore order in the Ferghana society. Most archival sources refer to bandits as unidentified criminals or unknown attackers. They were unknown because the police could never find them and did not have the resources to track them. The fact that bandits were unknown, even as their identities were clearly evident to locals, indicates the inability of the Russian authorities to eliminate or decrease banditry and the lack of confidence of the local population in their powers. Bands of robbers in the Ferghana Valley robbed and stole for months at a time without having any fear of being caught and punished. For bandits, it was easy not only to exist but also to flourish. Some of the groups robbed through 2 or 3 places a day or night. In Kokand in 1907, during the night of December 25, the same band robbed 3 places. First they broke into a shop, then the apartment of a bank clerk, and finally went on to rob the apartment of a Jewish person. The passivity and unwillingness of policemen allowed many robberies to spiral out of control, even in those cases when the criminals were few and could easily be caught. The socialist newspaper reported about a crime that occurred on a train from Margilan to Tashkent when a Central Asian woman was robbed by a few people who looked like Persians, that's how the newspaper describes, who stole over 100 rubles from the woman. What was shocking was that it happened in front of few policemen who did nothing. When the train stopped in Kokand city, the bandits got off and the police did nothing to stop them. It was the people at the station, the local people at the station who intervened, but the robbers, with the help of their knives, got on a carriage and left as if nothing had happened. Armed robberies were committed by well-outfitted and organized gangs and became a real disaster in the Ferghana Valley in 1905 and afterward, because during these revolutionary years, the government, the police, and the court system were particularly weak and incompetent. This weakness allowed the gangs to be defiant and behave with impunity. Banditry proved the inability of frustrated authorities to deal with the increasing crime in the Ferghana region, displayed the community's lack of respect and trust towards the police, and revealed that bandits held greater authority in their own towns, in their own cities and villages. As hooligans became the power in the streets of St. Petersburg, so did the bandits in the cities and villages of the Ferghana region, where they challenged and threatened Russian rule. The weakness of the police and court system gave bandits more courage as powerful figures. The lower classes and the outsiders, with their own understanding of culture, were a threat to Russian prestige in Turkestan. Poor Russians introduced the Central Asians to the worst evils that the Russian authorities tried to eliminate from their own society: drinking in public, prostitutes, bad language, which was adopted by the Central Asian population, and that caused the rise of banditry. Also, because the Russians were involved in robberies and even organized or joined gangs with the Central Asians, Persians, or Caucasians, Russian officials were doubly frustrated due to the fact that the Russians themselves tried to undermine Russian authority in Turkestan. Bandits showed the crisis of official authority by challenging control of the cities in the Ferghana Valley. Criminal gangs and bandits threatened the locals, disrupted the regime, and contributed to the turmoil of the revolutionary era. Even though it is not always possible to distinguish between the ordinary and political crime, the destruction caused by the criminals could be perceived as a political action. Any destructive behavior is an attack on the symbols of authority. In the presentation, I had time only to highlight just one area of unrest that I feature in the dissertation. In addition to displaying the social disorder and lawlessness of banditry during this heretofore depicted quiet time in Ferghana, my dissertation highlights the disruptive and extensive political and economic violence of this period. Early 20th century political violence in Russia and some other regions of the Russian Empire has been the subject of investigation for numerous researchers. My research explores political violence in the unique context of the Ferghana Valley in 1905-1910. And I argue that while political and economic violence in the Ferghana Valley had been ignored by previous scholarship, it was a highly significant topic to authorities in the region, and a substantial factor in destabilization. My work as a whole begins with 3 chapters outlining the history of Ferghana, and especially Andijan, as a railroad town and the ensuing social and cultural chaos. The 1876 Russian conquest brought about many changes in local Ferghana society. But the Russians' fear of an uprising by the Central Asian population changed and defined most of the preceding policies. The tensions were caused by numerous issues, including limited land and its use, the influx of outsiders, and a lack of basic services. The issues and problems discussed in my chapters show the unsteady ground for the base of further events, which unfolded during the revolution of 1905-1907. The Russian Revolution of 1905-1907 affected the minds and mood of the local Russian population of the Ferghana Valley. Its effect may not have been to the same degree as it was in central Russia or other regions of Russian Turkestan, but nevertheless, the population of the Ferghana Valley experienced urban industrial and railway workers' movements and soldiers' unrest, as well as rural uprisings by the Central Asian population protesting high taxes. Consequently, Russian policy in Turkestan was vigorously tested during the Russian Revolution of 1905. Russian authorities were losing control. The Russian administration continued to encounter problems and issues, especially regarding the revolutionary events in Russia and the revolution's influence on the people of Turkestan, the new subject of Russia. Between 1905 and 1907, the Ferghana Valley was struck by a wave of political violence and banditry, a clear indication of dissatisfaction with the existing social, economic, and political conditions in the Ferghana Valley. I outlined the chaos of the revolutionary years in terms of banditry and political violence. My conclusions challenge the established vision of Ferghana as an unimportant backwater by underscoring the ways in which it served as a crossroads of revolutionary thought and peoples from Russia, the Caucasus, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. In so doing, I challenged the St. Petersburg-centered approach to empire studies that has dominated the field and highlight the ways in which labor migration and social upheaval can be as important as the transport of political ideas across boundaries. Thank you so much.